Good morning, everybody, and welcome. My name is Rupert Read. I am the co-director of the Climate Majority Project. And at this point, I'm going to take the opportunity to do a teeny advert. Here is the Climate Majority Project book. Some of the authors who are in it are on this call. Many of you have got it or read it. And I must say, it is selling very well. We are quite pleased. It's easy to get from all extremely good bookshops and the Climate Majority Project Direct. Or the Publishers London Publishing Partnership. So do consider getting that if you are interested in us, and I'm guessing that you are, or you probably wouldn't be here. So we are absolutely delighted to have with us this morning someone who's been a supporter of the CMP since the beginning, really. He is a signatory of our founding statement that you can find on our website. If someone can put our website in the chat, just in case any of you have not seen it, that would be great. He is Ben Goldsmith. He has many hats and many things that he does, but he's probably best known as a philanthropist, a conservationist, and especially someone who is expert in and a practitioner of rewilding. And as you will have gathered, the topic for this morning's Climate Majority Thinks, our regular webinar series, is rewilding, with a special emphasis on the relevance to ecosystem-based adaptation and climate adaptation at large. Can I at this point ask everybody who is not Ben or myself to mute yourselves? If you don't, you will be muted, but it's much more helpful if you can just mute yourselves. I am going to go over to Ben in a second. And what is going to happen on this webinar is that Ben is going to speak for a little while, 10 or 15 minutes. I'm going to engage in conversation with him for another 10 or 15 minutes. And then we will have a good long time for a free and open discussion. And the call will be finished by 10:30 sharp, so we can get on with our days. So we'll wrap up just a little bit before then. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Ben. You may wish to put your machine onto speaker view and to highlight Ben's image in your screen for the next part of the call. But I'll leave that up to you. Ben, very much welcome, and we look forward very much to hearing what you have to say about this very important topic here this morning. Ben Goldsmith.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I feel very grateful to be asked to come and join in this webinar. A Climate Majority Project is exactly what's needed. I mean, I think it's becoming more obvious, certainly to the kinds of people that are on this call, that there really is a majority for tackling the climate crisis and for healing nature. You know, like poll after poll we see shows that there doesn't seem to be a dividing line between, say, young and old on this issue, or rural and urban, or rich and poor, left-leaning or right-leaning. You know, it strikes me that people everywhere in this country demand action on kind of both sides of the coin, which are climate and nature. And I don't know if people have seen what happened in Austria. You know, truly brave politician whose name I forget, but the environment minister of Austria sort of unilaterally went ahead and turned over her country's decision not to support the nature restoration law. And as a result of the change of position of Austria, the nature restoration law at the EU level was passed. And it's just a momentous moment and a demonstration of how brave politicians can be. And in doing that, she quoted polls that showed 80% of Austrians wanted their country to support the nature restoration law. So when we get told that people don't want action on these things, you know, it's complete nonsense. I mean, they're either telling fibs or they just you know, they're just not reading the room. And I think, I don't know whether it was lockdowns or I don't know what has triggered it, but something big has changed, I think, in the last few years. I mean, we feel it. And that's especially in relation to nature. Now, I think people have come to understand that nature is of visceral importance to us in ways that perhaps we struggle to articulate. You know, when I was a kid, I was always the nerdy one in the, you know, in the garden. You know, you look out the window and I'd be kind of putting up bird boxes or trying to dig ponds, or, you know, had my little pair of binoculars. I was obsessed as a child. And I remember writing to the guy who ran Richmond Park when I was 11 years old and saying, could we not have wild boar back in Richmond Park? And I got a very polite and friendly letter back. And I wrote to the Country Life and said that their readers lack imagination when it comes to things like wild boar and beavers, and I got the star letter. Now, I was a real nature nerd, and I'd sit next to, a lovely aunt or a friend of my mum's at a dinner or a Sunday lunch, and they'd say, "Oh, you're the one that's interested in nature," as if it's kind of stamp collecting or something. And I sort of knew on some level that it wasn't like stamp collecting, that this was more important. I knew that I needed in some way to be outside in nature. But it took me, half a lifetime to understand that we really do need to be in nature. It's not a nice to have. Anecdotally, we know this, and science reveals tiny fragments of the mystery with each passing year. We know now, for example, that when we walk in the woods, the trees emit compounds that when we breathe them in, they lower our heart rate. They lower our blood pressure. They make us feel happy. Why the trees feel the need to make us feel happy, why this happens, no one knows. But the Japanese Health Service have incorporated forest bathing into their treatment plans for millions of patients suffering from both physical and mental issues. And it's you get a chit, you get free public transport, you go to a particular designated piece of nature, and you tell your doctor, "Yep, I was there for an hour a day for the last month, doctor." And hospital patients in California have been shown to get better faster if they can simply see nature out of their hospital windows. So we are nature. Nature is us, and there is a belly connection that we are far from understanding, but which is not a nice to have. And I think people have realized this and feel unafraid to articulate this now. And that's why when the Knepp estate reintroduces white storks, and suddenly there's 100 white storks kettling above the skies of Sussex for the first time in 500 or 600 years, it's one of the most popular stories on the BBC website for the whole year. Millions of people are logging on to these live cams and watching ospreys, which have been reintroduced on Poole Harbour. Imagine if we think as environmentalists on this call of our own friends 10 years ago, how many of them knew that beavers were once native to Britain? How many? None. Now you stop someone random on the street and they'll probably know that beavers are not only native, but that they're back, and that they're playing a keystone role in the management of our hydrological systems and in breathing life back into our landscapes. There's kind of an awakening that's taken place. And I think that is translating into voter pressure, and some politicians are smart enough to see it. I think the Labour Party are in a much better place on nature than they've ever been. I think they recognize the political opportunity here. I'm sure we'll talk more about that side of things in a minute. But the other change is the kind of, how are we going to do it part of it? It's all very well longing for nature recovery, and it's all very well wanting more nature in our cities and in our countryside. It's all very well wanting these things to happen, but how do we actually do it? And it's all about incentives. And I completely buy the argument that George Monbiot, who I admire hugely, one of the great inspirations of my life, puts forward, which is, how do you value something which is inherently priceless? How do you value the love we feel for our family, or how do you value the song of a nightingale if you're lucky enough to hear one, in early summer? And of course you can't. But the thing is that we have been valuing these things. We have been valuing nature. We've just been valuing them at zero in our political and economic and infrastructure and development decision making forever. So I think what's changing now is an understanding as to the practical and I think, without being crude, the financial value of nature. And I think we need that, if we are going to make good things happen. So just to give an example, the country spends somewhere between 10 and 20 billion pounds a year trying to mitigate flooding, trying to adapt to flooding, and trying to clean up the mess following flooding. And of course, causes misery for huge numbers of people every year. We now know that if you restore nature in particular parts of the catchment, in the hills and in the valleys, if you restore wetlands and re-meander streams, and put back ponds and so on, we now understand that slows the flow and it helps mitigate flooding. We now know that works. And it also deals with the problem of drought and hosepipe bans in the summer. And these ecosystems also are full of nature. They fill our hearts with joy. They sequester carbon, and they do all kinds of things. These things have a monetary value for society. And so what's changing, not just in the UK, but across the world, is that governments and the private sector are starting to recognize that value, and they're starting to pay for it. So lots of local authorities up and down the country are working in partnership with the Environment Agency to invest in natural flood management, building wetlands, providing incentives for landowners of all different kinds to restore nature in order to regulate hydrology. That's just one example of paying for nature. And it feels on a philosophical level strange, the idea of nature as infrastructure. But if we don't, it won't happen. Previously, the incentives have been all wrong. Under the old common agricultural policy of the EU, you were disincentivized to have any nature on your land. Now, there's an eye in the sky that looks at your land, and if you've allowed some scrub to grow, or if you've allowed water to accumulate at that wet corner of your farm, the kind of place where the woodcock like to come, where the ducks are, then you will get a letter saying that bit of land is not eligible. It's no longer farmable, and you wouldn't get your subsidy. So as a result, the old system created a completely skewed incentive to do the opposite of what the public wants and what we need, which is to restore nature. So I do think there is good news in this country in that we now have a publicly funded environmental land management scheme, which directly rewards landowners for delivering public goods, restoring nature for the benefit of things like flood mitigation, drought mitigation, clean water, and so on. And if you think of that new scheme as a kind of icebreaker ship, there's a flotilla of private market mechanisms growing up now where water companies have recognized it's in their interest for there to be better nature in their patch. So they will go and work with clusters of farmers and say, look, we have to deliver clean water to people's taps all year round. And we can't do that if this land is being flayed for intensive farming purposes, in the way that it is. We're running out of water in the summer, and the water that we do get is dirty and polluted, and it's not working. So slowly but surely, the value of nature in an economic sense is starting to be recognized. And I think this is going to be the big change. This is the tools, this is the toolbox by which we set about actually changing things. And I just want to touch upon livelihoods. Where does that leave people who've done things a particular way for generations in particular parts of the country? Now, Henry Dimbleby's National Food Strategy report showed that about 85% of the food we produce in this country comes from just 20% of the land. 85% from just 20% of the land. That's mostly East Anglia and the kind of grade 1, grade 2 land. The least productive 20 to 25% of our land produces a tiny fraction, maybe 1, perhaps 2% of the food. Now, this is our national parks, Bodmin, Dartmoor, Selwood, where I am in Somerset, the Pennines, the Lake District. These are not delivering food. They're not delivering food security in the way that they're currently managed, but they are delivering a whole bunch of societal problems in the form of flash flooding and loss of soil and loss of biodiversity. And they could be extraordinary nature and carbon sinks and providing all kinds of benefits. And the beauty of the ecosystem that we live in Northwestern Europe is that native cattle are a keystone species. Professor Franz Vera, on whose work NEP was put together, describes 4 fundamental keystone species who drive all the rest in our ecosystems. The first of those is the beaver. I mentioned beavers earlier, and I'm obsessed with beavers. I don't think they're a kind of eccentric obsession. The beavers are the absolute key to breathing life back into our landscapes because they hold water along these beautiful mosaic ribbon wetlands that they create. And that water is habitat for everything from amphibians to fish to wading birds. It's watering holes for larger animals. And of course, it helps us in terms of reducing flooding and drought. So beavers are one of the 4. A second of the 4 is the pig, or its wild cousin, the wild boar, because they turn the soil and they rootle, and so they rotivate the soil. And about a third of the wild plants that grow in Britain require bare earth in which to germinate. So tree species that are pretty much absent from our landscapes, aspen, black poplar, those species rely on the activities of wild boar. Flowers, poppies, scarlet pimpernel, cornflowers, all these little annual ephemeral wildflowers, they really need the activities of wild boar. They're nature's gardeners. So the extensive pannage of pigs or the existence of wild boar in the landscape is an essential keystone. The third that Franz Vera describes is the activity of large, heavy herbivores, because by their grazing and their browsing and their trampling and their dung, they create this, they are the dynamism in an ecosystem. Without them, you end up with a dark, closed canopy woodland. But once you have these large cattle eating lots of the baby scrub and trees that come up through the ground, you get these wonderful semi-open, sun-dappled woodland mosaics, which are just absolutely heaving with wildlife. And NEP, of course, has been the scientific demonstration of that. And the beauty of that third keystone factor, and to some extent the second, which is the pigs, is that farmers don't have to stop farming. They just need to revert to a more traditional, gentler, wilder way of farming. So that's where the incentives are pointing. That's where they really need to point to help, intensive farmers in landscapes that are simply not suited to intensive farming. The sheep ranches in the uplands, for example, to shift to a more gentle way of farming with native cattle. And there's some lovely examples, the Horned Beef Company with their little box scheme producing high quality beef from cattle that lived semi-wild out in woodland mosaics. There's technology now such as no fence, where they put a collar on the cow and it tells you where your cow is. Is it okay? What's its temperature? Is it moving all right? And it tells the cow where it can and can't go with a sound and then a beep, a vibration that they learn. So there is this silver bullet when it comes to a just transition for farmers in our less productive landscapes. And we want them to farm in such a way that nature can recover in a dramatic way, but they still get to farm. They still have livestock. And of course, the fourth keystone is the wolf, or the apex predator, which controls all the smaller grazers. Deer are out of control in this country. In the productive croplands of East Anglia, you have sometimes herds of 100 or 200 fallow, decimating crops. We've got Lyme disease on the rise. The animals themselves, especially in Scotland, are underweight and not doing well because they're so overpopulated. We've removed the apex predator from the ecosystem, and the result is we're not able to stay on top of deer numbers. And the only places in Europe where deer and wild boar are under control and in equilibrium are the places where you have predators. So just for completeness, that fourth keystone still remains absent. And I strongly believe that we'll have wolves not just back in the wilder reaches of the Highlands, but I think we'll have wolves back in East Anglia and in our suburban landscapes, in our lifetimes. It's happened on every single continental European country with no mishaps. Go to Normandy or Fontainebleau on the edge of Paris, or Amsterdam or Madrid or Rome. There's 6,000 wolves in Italy now, but people are absolutely fine with it. Any of you that have been on holiday in Europe recently will have been in a landscape populated with wolves. So I think change is in the air, and I'm tremendously optimistic that that the UK is going to be somewhat a leader in restoring nature in what is one of the most industrialized and nature depleted landscapes on Earth. So there's a dose of optimism for you.
Mm-hmm. Ben, thank you so much. What a small and perfectly formed talk, and a wonderful way to get us started here this morning. I think that people could hear very clearly in what you were saying there, your passion and your erudition and your commitment, and we vibrate and resonate strongly with those qualities. I hope. As mentioned before, I'm going to start with a few questions from the chair, and questions that people have sort of suggested to us before today for things to talk about. So I'll start with one on what you've just said. So you've gone right there with wolves. But wolves are going to be tough, are they not, to get across the line in England, which is a densely populated country. Can you speak to the prospects of other predators as more easy intermediate steps? So where do you think we are in relation to the lynx, for instance? And are there also other predators which would be less difficult than wolves, even though they wouldn't be easy? What about bears, for instance? Where do you stand on bears? I mean,
Well, I feel like I'm in a friendly audience, and I
yes,
thought
I think so.
for completeness, I thought it would be worth describing the four keystone processes that Franz Vera identifies, as being crucial to the development of healthy ecosystems in northwestern Europe. And of course, all four of those keystone processes were removed at roughly the same time from our remoter landscapes. The dreadful highland clearances of the 18th and 19th centuries were about removing people from these remote landscapes, not just in Scotland. We talk about the Scottish highland clearances, but the same occurred in the Welsh landscapes and also in the English uplands, to make way for huge sheep ranches. The sheep were the number one cause of the loss of villages in the British Isles between 1500 and 1900. Number one. And with the people went their native cattle, they went their pigs. The wild boar was made extinct around that time. and so was the wolf, and the beaver was gone maybe a century earlier. And what we saw was ecosystem collapse. If you go to the central Cambrian plateau of Wales, or you go to the much of the Highlands of Scotland, we're looking at what are some of the most degraded landscapes that you'll find anywhere in Europe. And in the western fringes of Britain, these were rainforests. These were Atlantic temperate rainforest mosaics covering possibly as much as 20% of the western fringes of the British Isles. Places that were wet enough for plants to grow on plants. Twinkling, magical, extraordinary ecosystems. If you visit a place like Wistman's Wood, which is only 8 acres on the edge of Dartmoor, you get a glimpse of how it was. So these processes are essential, and without the fourth and trickiest one of them, I think we'll struggle to get the kind of nature recovery that we want. And we'll also face a growing threat to our food security, because you just can't grow crops if you've got huge numbers of deer marauding through the landscape. And study after study from Canada to France has shown that human hunting is simply not capable of staying on top of the deer, because it's not just about numbers, it's about behavior. They need to live in a landscape of fear. In the absence of predation, they're perfectly happy to mill about in the easiest places, in your field of wheat, for example, or in the lush fringes of a river, eating everything that should be holding the riverbank together. It's only when there's a landscape of fear that they change their behavior, and you start to restore equilibrium. So we have to have them back. How do we get them back? I mean, I think the strategy, as far as I'm concerned, for bringing lynx back is to talk about wolves as much as possible. Because, and I think that is what I've been trying to do. And I think lynx is going to be easy, because there is a consultation underway in Scotland. The Scottish Rewilding Alliance is a pretty diverse and broad group. And the opposition to lynx seems to be melting away in Scotland. And one group in particular stands out, which is Big Picture Scotland, Pete Cairns, who's been doing town hall meeting after town hall meeting for a decade now, talking about these kinds of issues. And most people are pretty relaxed now about this. And I think the English project is not far behind. A combination of the wildlife trusts and the Lifescape project are working on links to Kielder and in the north of England. They're in the midst of a consultation at the moment. I think it will happen. As for wolves, I agree, it doesn't feel close, does it? But 10 years ago, neither did wild boar and beavers. I mean, even when I joined the board of DEFRA, I felt like people wanted me sacked for talking openly about bringing beavers back. And now everyone's totally relaxed about beavers. So I think we will get there, especially with the European experience. When, if Ursula von der Leyen, EU Commission President, and her cohort, if they just back off their kind of obsession with killing off wolves, which will be pretty tricky to do anyway now, they're pretty well established in every European country. And when people just get absolutely used to the idea of seeing a wolf trotting alongside the dual carriageway, when they go on holiday in northern France or something, and people aren't being attacked, and livestock killed are very minimal. 0.02% of French sheep were killed by wolves last year. It's nothing. I think eventually it just becomes silly, the opposition. So I think it'll happen, but it sounds radical now. And maybe if this was a different group, maybe if this was the Oxford Farming Conference, I might not necessarily have jumped straight to wolves in the first.
But I love what you said when you said the best way to get lynx is to talk about wolves. It's a bit like the way that sometimes, not always, but sometimes the radical flank of the environmental movement helps organizations like ours to actually achieve what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, that's what George Monbiot talks about, the Overton window.
Yeah.
In the same way that Jeremy Corbyn moved the Overton window to the left, or Margaret Thatcher a generation earlier moved the Overton window to the right, or on wolves and lynx, George Monbiot successfully moved the Overton window towards a wilder future. The parameters within which debate is considered rational.
Yeah. I must say, so I visited George at his home when he was just starting on the project for his book, Feral, on rewilding. And he told me about it. And my honest first thought was, oh my God, people will think this is so extreme. People just aren't going to get this. This is going to cause a terrible backlash. I didn't say that to him, but that was exactly what I first thought. And I'm so glad that I was wrong. And it seems to me it's actually one of the most important things he's ever done. Is the way that with that book, he helped to move the Overton window on this issue that we're talking about here this morning.
I agree. And by the way, that book was so important for me as well. I didn't know George Monbiot before that book, and made a real point of, I'm a bit of a groupie, having read it, because it gave me permission. It enabled me to give myself permission to talk about things that I never really dared talk about in public before.
Mm.
You know, I was happy with feeding the birds and putting up bird boxes and digging some ponds, and it never really. I don't think deep down it ever occurred to me that I could live in a country with real natural processes and real wildlife. I always thought, no,
Mm.
we'll settle for newts and bats and field margins. And his book made me think, no, actually, bollocks to that. You know, why should we settle? You know,
Yes. Yeah, very good. So one of the things we try to do in the Climate Majority Project, Ben, as you know, is to have respectful and civil discussions, even about things that we disagree about. So I want to go into a little more what you said in your opening remarks about the economic valuation of nature and look into that. Because that, of course, is a topic where you're not on the same page as George Monbiot, and also where I and my academic colleagues, before I left academia last year to found the Climate Majority Project, but before I left, I did these, I got these big grants to look at ecosystem services and natural capital. And we came up with some quite significant concerns about them. So I just want to air this issue with you a bit. You mentioned in your remarks about the valuation of nature, the success that there has been in relation to the hydrological cycle with some of these schemes. And I think that's right. But what one of the things that our research showed is that there's been very little success elsewhere. In other words, that it seems to be only in hydrology that you've got good examples of where paying for ecosystem services has actually worked well to protect nature. And my real concern, my real, if you will, philosophical and ethical concern is that if we extend this principle too much, then we start to get people into a mindset where they're thinking, well, what nature is really for is to do these things for us, which can be economically valued. So how do you handle these kinds of concerns about whether the scope of the valuation of economics of ecosystem services is actually goes much wider than water, and whether there are real hazards wherever it gets employed in terms of getting us to not think about nature in such an intrinsic way?
yeah. So I, you know how on social media you can put a little quote underneath your name in your bio. Well,
Yeah.
my one is a quote by Edward Abbey saying, "The idea of wilderness needs no defense; it only needs defenders." So I philosophically completely agree with you. Nature for nature's sake. You know, I also recoil from the idea that nature is there to serve us. You know, I have a huge problem with that philosophically. You know, I don't think we should have to articulate why it's useful to us. You know, why is an animal, a
Yeah.
wild animal or a rose useful to us? I don't think to George, just embody George Monbiot on this, because I think it's actually a very widespread view. I don't think he would disagree with the idea of public money being used to procure environmental services, in the sense that he's very in favor of the public money for public goods approach to land management subsidies or farm subsidies. So the environmental land management scheme has its cheerleaders from across the political spectrum. The idea that if public money is going to be used to support a particular sector, say farming, then that should be linked to the provision of quantifiable public goods. So the principle of understanding what benefits nature have for people is going to be embedded in the way the public purse allocates funding in the countryside. And a lot of the most successful hydrology payments are local authorities, the Environment Agency, and so
Yes.
on. So I
Yes.
think the principle of using public money for public good, I think, is not so contentious. It becomes trickier when you start inviting private sector participants into the equation to do that. And the problem is that they're already doing it with land in a bunch of non-beneficial ways. So if someone looks at a hillside in Scotland that may come up for sale, you know, they'd look at it from the context of how many spruce trees can I plant in a monoculture on there, or how many sheep can I cram on there, or how many miserable underweight red deer can we cram on there and feed in the winter so they can be shot from the window of my Land Rover. You know, that people look at land and ecosystems already with a view to what they can extract from it, and that is the way the market works all over the world. When people, developers in Sri Lanka, look at a mangrove, they think, well, they don't look at what value the mangrove is giving to local communities in terms of flood defense or nursery for young fish that then grow into fish that people catch and eat, or provision of sand for the beaches on which the tourism industry depends. They look at it from the perspective of how big a shrimp farm can I put here, or how big a hotel can I put here. So I think the problem is it's already the market is making these decisions, but it's valuing nature in those decisions. So all I think we need to do is just we need to underpin that decision making with good science that shows in economic terms what nature is worth. If you destroy that woodland, you will get greater costs tackling flooding in that town, if you see what I mean.
Yes, of course, that is an alternative potential way one can go about doing this kind of thing, basing things around the precautionary principle, having taxes and disincentives for doing the wrong.
Polluter pays.
Yeah, having regulations, having potential criminal prosecutions, etc., etc. Those approaches may get driven out by an approach which is economically focused.
And I think that's a genuine risk. So I think that the absolute priority has to be it has to be fairness, in the sense that nobody should get a free ride. If I'm polluting that watercourse, I should pay a penalty, and I should not leave society to carry the can. And I think that is where many conservatives who profess themselves to be free market enterprise people are bullshitting us, because many of them are not into free market enterprise when industries that they like are asked to carry to pay the cost of their own damage. If on their own turf, let's say if you want to argue on their own turf with the kind of Adam Smith lens, we believe in free and fair markets and free enterprise, well, then society should not be subsidizing your activities by cleaning up your pollution. So it doesn't matter where you are in your economic theory, it should be an absolute given that the polluter pays. And even that should be agreed from John McDonnell to Jacob Rees-Mogg. And the problem is a great slug of people on the right don't really believe that. They would consider that kind of regulation to be government overreach, without recognizing that without government regulation, you don't have a free and fair market, which is what they're supposed to believe in. So I think the absolute first line of defense has to be good regulation. Absolutely. Yes. And I think that's as much a conservative principle as it is, a more of a left-leaning one. Yes. And then within the context of a proper rule book and a free and fair market, I think people should be able to look at a piece of land or whatever and think, well, if I team up with that community and shift the way that land is managed, turn it into a wetland, which is going to benefit a bunch of different people, then I should receive some incentive for doing that, whether it's from the local authority, from the government, or even for the private water company. And, I don't personally believe that privatizing the water companies was a particularly good idea, but in the world we live in, I think it's perfectly rational for a private water company to spend its capital budget on nature in the same way that it would build a concrete water treatment plant. I think that would be a rational decision. It gets murkier when you start to look at reputational areas like voluntary carbon and biodiversity credits and so on. Sorry, Bonnie Houston's made a really good point. I wouldn't be up for paying farmers for not polluting. They should be required by law not to pollute, and there should be swinging penalties for polluting. But if they do the opposite of polluting, which is they create ecosystems which eat other people's pollution, the wetlands are like a kidney in the landscape. They eat up pollution. They allow sediment to sink lower. That's why beavers are so important. I think if they're providing that service on land that they could be using to grow a timber crop or could be using to raise sheep, then maybe there should be some reward for that. And that's how, what was it? What Charlie Munger, the investor in America, always says: show me the incentive and I'll show you the result. And he argues that incentives are very, very important in shifting behaviors. So I think it's a combination of carrots and sticks. But just to jump to carbon and biodiversity credits, I think it's really important we don't allow polluting companies off the hook by buying voluntary carbon or biodiversity credits, which is kind of what's been happening to some extent. So those markets need to operate within a high integrity framework if they're to exist at all. And if you look at the work that Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England, is doing, he's got a thing which is all about developing high integrity for carbon and biodiversity markets. But if you just shut those down and just say, look, I think you risk throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Now, Pakistan has finally got round to restoring its mangroves. 8,000 hectares of new mangroves restored around Karachi alone. enormous value to society, and Pakistan could never have afforded to do that. And it was all paid for through voluntary carbon markets. Sub-Saharan African communities in places like northern Kenya, are getting money from voluntary carbon that's paying for healthcare, education, livelihoods, and nature. They call it charismatic carbon. People pay extra. They pay 3 times the price per ton, and they get all these extras. And it's something like $250 million flowing into really deprived rural communities in some of the most important biodiversity hotspots across sub-Saharan Africa. So if we just said, look, we're not going to do voluntary carbon, that's the global decision, it's not happening, that's a huge opportunity missed, I think. My instinct is we need to try and find a way, and I don't have the answers.
Yeah, well, thank you. That's a good.
By the way, can I just pause to just say I'm a big enthusiast, like all of you. I'm no expert. You used the term expert earlier on. I'm not an expert in anything. I just love nature, and I really care, and I try to use whatever any kind of leverage at my disposal to try and advance the cause, like you all do. I'm definitely not an expert. An expert is Franz Vera.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Ben. Humble as well. Very good. So you mentioned right-leaning, left-leaning conservatives, etc. When we created the idea for this webinar today, of course, we didn't know when the general election was going to be. So I think it's appropriate that we have a question on that. The Climate Majority Project, of course, was designed from the beginning to be non-partisan. We deliberately brought conservatives on board to make the point that it's about everybody moving in the right direction. It's not about one particular ideology. One ideology is not going to be enough. You mentioned voter pressure also earlier. How do you see this election, Ben, as someone who has, while being often kind to the Green Party in the past, has basically been a conservative yourself? We've got a government now which has got a pretty bad record on nature and on climate. As you say, the opposition has been cleaning up its act in this regard, although not going as far as many people would wish. Tell us a little about how if this isn't putting you too much on the spot, how you're seeing this election and where we go from here after the election. And one more thing about that from a climate majority perspective, what we are hoping to do is to pressure all the parties over time to get more into a arguments for doing the best on climate and the best on nature rather than running away from it. How do you see how we can make that more likely to happen, to have the parties clamoring over who's got the strongest policies rather than who's got the weakest policies?
Yeah. So just to give you the context of my kind of personal politics. We've all got our personal politics, and overwhelmingly the big issue for me has been nature all my life. That's the thing I care about most, and I would always vote for the candidate who has got the most to offer on nature. So as a result, in the last 20 years, my adult life, I voted for 4 different parties. I voted Labour in the mayoral election, for example, because Citing was just much stronger on these things. And I voted Green a lot in my life, probably voted Green more than any other party. But that is the overriding context. I care about nature. Over all other issues. And previously, I always thought that was quite a precious thing. There weren't that many people who would put nature top. Now, I think a lot of people, a majority, have nature and climate very high up the list. I'm instinctively, in a very kind of woolly way, I think, a sort of small c liberal conservative. I never studied political philosophy, but I just was always a bit rebellious at school, and I've always had trouble with too much authority, and I don't like too much big government. I kind of like government that is responsible and kind, but isn't too overweening. Headmaster politics slightly bums me out. So I think probably instinctively small government, free enterprise within a good regulatory system, free and fair markets, and kind of socially liberal. So I sort of, philosophically probably lean conservative in some way. That being said, we're on the environment today. Where are we at? I think, where do I think we're at? So I think the Conservatives are guilty actually of green hushing. It's a term I only just learned recently. They actually did some pretty good stuff. Under Theresa May and then Boris Johnson, with Michael Gove and then George Eustice at DEFRA, there's some pretty amazing stuff in there that was done. So, for example, the Blue Belt, that's an area of no take marine protected areas the size of the Indian subcontinent that's been declared in just a few short years in UK overseas territories. We are now, I think, the world's number one or possibly the world's number two largest. We have the largest portfolio of real marine protected areas of any country in the world. That's pretty amazing. The government has never trumpeted that. If I was a Conservative MP and been involved in that, I'd be trumpeting the Blue Belt. The phase out of coal is going to happen in 2035. It happened in 2020 instead. You've got the Environment Act 2021, which gives legal underpinning to the 25-year environment plan. And it's a really good piece of legislation that, and it's probably the biggest and best and most ambitious set of targets and regulations in the Environment Act than that of any OECD nation. It's a really good piece of work. And then the Office for Environmental Protection, which technically speaking has the power to jail the Secretary of State if they don't meet environmental targets. I mean, it's a proper ombudsman. The Office for Environmental Protection. Boris Johnson said it needed to be tough and it needed to have teeth, and it did. And then the Agriculture Act we talked about earlier, I think that's the biggest change of all, in my opinion. I think you already see it. You go on the train, north, south, east, or west in this country, you're starting to see change. And maybe we'll lay out a template for agricultural subsidies in other countries of the world. Now, imagine if the Farm Bill in the US or the Common Agriculture Policy in Europe decided to copy the English Environmental Land Management Scheme. And there's a Fisheries Act. There's just lots of good stuff that they've done. The Species Reintroductions Task Force in DEFRA didn't exist before, and now it doesn't have nearly enough ambition. It's not funded enough, but it exists, and it's looking at reintroducing all kinds of species, from pool frogs in Norfolk to harvest mice in Cornwall, and so on. So I just don't understand how they can be misreading the polls. Why are they not trumpeting this stuff? Why are they not? Aren't politicians at election time supposed to talk about all the good things they've done and ham it up and exaggerate and say, look at us, look at us? They're doing the exact opposite. They're even saying, if we get a chance, we'll row back on some of this stuff, which is a huge turnoff to everyone. It doesn't matter where you sit on anything else. It's just, what are they doing? So I don't understand it. I really can't understand it. And someone used this term green hushing. And I think that's what they're doing, because I don't think the track record's as bad as everyone would have us believe. I think they've actually done some quite good stuff. Just the rhetoric's been really bad in the last 2 years, and nothing much new has happened during that time. And if they got another term, I fear that we might even go backwards on some of this stuff. Labour, on the other hand, excellent on climate, I think, really ambitious, and on nature, some good noises, and I'm optimistic that they will do some good things, but we don't really know yet. They're very scared, Labour, of offending traditional rural vested interests, and if they can be persuaded that rural vested interests are anti-environmental land management scheme, and if we do rewilding in our national parks, we'll all starve, and those of us who don't starve are going to, you're going to get eaten by beavers or something. I think there's a danger they could be persuaded by vested interests that, to back off, and not do this stuff. Yeah. So it's all to play for with Labour. And the Greens, I've always loved the Greens. I fear that they've just become too all over the place a little bit recently, and talking about, I want them to be the champion of nature, like Caroline Lucas has been. And if you follow on Twitter, a lot of them are talking about all kinds of other issues which don't necessarily have that much bearing on the ones we're discussing today. And I find that lack of focus, I find intimidating and disappointing. But who am I? I'm just another voter. You ask my view. So I think it's no easy choices. As always, I've signed the commitment. I know I'll pick the greenest candidate in my patch. That's what I'll do, no matter which party they're from.
That's a very interesting answer. Thanks so much, Ben. Now, in a moment, I'm going to go to the room. So do be thinking about your questions. And when we come to questions, I'll be happy for people to put them in the chat. But we'd also be delighted to have people putting their questions absolutely directly with their voices. So if you want to do that in a moment, then do feel free to put your electronic hand up. But before that, I'm going to ask one more slightly challenging question, which is that it's absolutely obvious from what you've been saying on this call, that Ben, that there's absolutely so much in common that you have with the Climate Majority project, and I'm sure much in common with many of the people on the call. However, also there's probably some things where you would disagree with some people on this call. Some of your tweets attract quite a lot of attention, and possibly not always for the absolute best of reasons. How do you navigate what we see as a really important challenge, which is trying to avoid and indeed reverse the endemic polarization that's really taken hold in our political culture? And one might think of that in relation to maybe some things you've said sometimes on Twitter on rewilding, but then there's also other topics as well, which we don't necessarily want to get into. But I'm just asking about the principle of whether one's writing about COVID or about Gaza or whatever it might be. How do you see and how do you see the way we should try to respond to the challenge of telling the truth and being honest and passionate, but without unnecessarily polarizing our culture?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, it's probably more helpful for me than for you or anyone else to have this conversation, because I mean, I think you're dead right. You know, it's, you know, I think this is the problem with social media is you can be sitting in the pub with some friends, you know, having a, you know, talking about you know, how ridiculous it is that the National Farmers Union is stopping the, you know, the licensing of free beaver releases. And one pint down, it's very easy to write a message saying, you know, the National Farmers Union is a toxic influence in our countryside, and you know, farmers are, you know, risking breaking apart the social contract with, you know, or whatever. Then you can use polarizing language, and then you get a volley of fury from sheep farmers in the national parks, or you know, yeah, exactly, or the national parks are utterly sheep wrecked. You know, like, I'm definitely guilty of that, and I think that, you know, in calmer, quieter moments, I know that a conciliatory approach, you know, is you know, a constructive approach is more likely to yield results. Now, you know, you sometimes wonder, how do you move that Overton window? Is it through being provocative? And can you be provocative without being polarizing? I think these are really important questions. And I think social media makes it too easy for us to be braver than we would be in person, or ruder than we would be in person. It makes it so quick that you can say something that you can't retract. You know, my mother always used to say, if you write a letter, just, you know, complaining about something to someone, put it on the mantelpiece and send it the next day. You know, and how often would you just not send it? So I yeah, we'll come back to Siobhan, but yeah, I think social media is unnuanced, and I think that it's, I need to be more careful with language around all topics. The second point for me personally, and I'm sure for all of you, is, you know, people listen to me on environment for some reason. You know, I've built myself a bit of a platform on environment. You know, people, I wrote a book, people buy my, you know, like, have a little bit of a platform. Why am I bothering to talk about any other issue? You know, it's totally pointless. I'm not a pundit. I'm not a politician. Why would I bother? And I think that's a really valid, you know, most of my friends and family would say, why bother? And I think they're probably right. And so I do go months on end with posting nothing but environment. But sometimes an issue, somehow I feel, you know, a sort of inner sense that I got to say something because no one else is, or everyone's saying something opposite. And if I don't stand up and say something, then I'm a coward, you know, because I'm not being true to myself on something that matters to me and that I care about. And I don't know that that's the right decision. So this is a really live topic for me. And I think probably the right answer is tweet about the environment and be careful with your language. You know, it's probably the right answer. You know, I don't know though. I don't know what the answer is.
Very
Really.
interesting, lovely. Once again, a lovely, thoughtful answer and reflective, and I think it's a process we're all engaged in. So, and we'd be keen to
Can I
carry on
jump back to?
engaging.
Can I answer Siobhan's question
Yeah, yeah,
on?
do yeah.
But because I do agree with Siobhan that especially in the last 2-3 years, you know, the record on decarbonisation in recent years has been weak. You know, it has, and you know, if you look at a 14-year track record, it's not bad. I mean, the UK has cut emissions faster than, you know, any other OECD country, and they haven't got everything wrong and they haven't got everything right. The last 3 years, I think, has you know, has been weak. I agree. You know, I don't know why we're licensing new oil and gas, for example. You know, so I think Siobhan's got a point. But what my point was more, why are they not trumpeting what they have done? Because they've done some good stuff. Why are they not trumpeting it? They know there's millions of voters out there that do care.
Very good, very interesting. Thanks so much. We have just under half an hour for the remainder of the discussion, which is completely open. So please jump in, folks. Raise your hand, and we'll unmute you, and you can speak with Ben. So who wants to go first? Jessica?
Yes, I'm so sorry. I'm going to have to jump off this call in a moment. So, and that's because of a pre-existing arrangement. So, please don't think it's because it's not fascinating. When you referenced Henry Dimbleby's book and a sort of joined up food and nature kind of policy, we haven't ever had that. It was very inspiring to read that people are having ideas around that area, but it just felt like very dismaying that it was processed but came to nothing. Do you have any hopes that looking forward, we may have something a little bit more constructive?
I mean, wouldn't it be great if which may end up being the case, that the new Labour government reaches out to those who advised the Conservative government and said, look, we want continuity. We're not totally tribal. We want, and imagine if Henry Dimbleby was invited back into government, to chair a task force and help put into place the things that weren't put into place under the last government. He's told me he reckons somewhere between a third and half of his recommendations are making their way into policy, which is way more than I thought. But he said there is lots of good stuff happening, but not nearly enough. Because it strikes me that if you fix food, you kind of fix everything, or a lot. A lot of our social and health problems, a lot of our landscape problems, if we can just fix food, and that food strategy report and his book, which I've got next to me somewhere, he wrote a book, which how annoying that I've forgotten the name of it. Oh, here we are. I have this book, obviously, but I also have this book, which is by Henry Dimbleby, and it's really, really good. And it describes a world in which we do fix the food system. And a lot of it's not that difficult, and pays for itself over and over and over again. So I hope the new government will look at food with a whole new, fresh eye. I'd love our landscapes to be either in kind of regenerative farming approaches, which feed us. The really productive land has to produce food for people, not for machines as bioenergy, or we've got to use good quality land to grow food for people in a way that doesn't trash soil and watercourses and pollinating insects and all the other natural capital that we depend on. So we need all of that. But on land which is less productive, I think we should go back to a medieval wild farming where you just produce a little bit of extensive beef or whatever. And
but are we going to be able, so sorry to jump in, but are we going to be able to cope with the changing kind of flooding patterns? Because that's really interrupted our food. I mean, those of us who are kind of focusing on the climate issue are just very alarmed that we might be facing food shortages. Do you think that can be knitted into the plan?
Yeah, because it's a food security really question is what you're saying. Yeah. So, I mean, they use food security as an argument against rewilding a lot. We can't do any of this green crap or nature crap because we're going to food security. It's nonsense. If we were really worried about food security, we'd look at things like food waste. Somewhere between a third and 50% of the food we produce ends up in the bin. When my mum was my age, it was less than 20%. We're really wasteful from farm all the way to fork, but there's no joined up government strategy on food waste. And also, what about the millions of acres of prime arable land that could be used to grow food for people that we use to grow food for machines as bioenergy, and we call it green, or for factory farmed animals? We figured out that you can confine pigs and cows and other things in chickens in indoor units and deprive them of every iota of joy, everything that makes life worth living, by feeding them grains that we've grown on prime agricultural land. And the conversion rate's terrible. I think it's something like 20 calories to produce 1 calorie. It's a terrible use of grain. If we tackled those two things, use good land to grow food for people and don't waste it, then we'd be fully self-sufficient very, very quickly. And in fact, we're already pretty food secure. Something like 2/3 of the food some people say 60%, some say 70% of the food we need is grown at home. And a lot of what we don't grow here are things we can't grow here, like avocados and bananas and things. Among the nations of the world, we're pretty food secure. You look at Egypt or other countries in the world, they must look at us with such envy. It's almost a bit entitled of us to be complaining about food security when we're in such a good position. The idea that fewer sheep on Dartmoor is going to have any negative bearing on our food security is complete nonsense. So I think, and And in fact, the greatest long-term threat to our food security is industrial farming, which is losing 2-3% of our soil. We need to figure out how to protect soil and so on. I think food security and environmental stewardship and restoration go hand in hand.
Super. Let's go to Bonnie Hewson, who's made some interesting comments in the chat just now that are relevant to this. Bonnie, will you tell us your thoughts, or I don't know if you may have a question in relation to them, but you don't need to have.
You put me on the spot. I feel like I've said enough in the chat. I'm very verbal on the chat. No, I've just been here to listen, really. I'm really interested in how people talk about this issue because it is really complicated. And I think politicians often think that people can't grasp the nuance of the complexity of the food and farming system, which underpins everything in our culture and society, right? Because surely isn't the main issue of society to provide enough food for all the people. It's like how society evolved. And obviously we're doing it in a way now which is putting ourselves and other living beings and the planet at risk. But we have a global food system, we have a global economy, we have sort of short-term politics, we have a lot of culture wars, there's a lot of complexity thrown in. There's a lot of questions around affordable food, nutritious food. And we put a lot of pressure on farmers who are now carrying the whole risk of transition, having been paid years ago to pull out all their hedges. Now they're being paid to put them back in. Obviously, there's a lot of tensions, and we're at risk of not being able to find a constructive way forward if we keep arguing about small things when there's bigger issues at risk. So I was just really fascinated to hear what Ben had to say and what other people might have to say around rewilding, farming, food production. I work in sort of shifting power into the hands of producers and consumers and supporting agroecology transition in the UK, which is a really interesting sector to be in at this time. So I don't know if I've got a specific question other than just being really fascinated how this touches upon everyone else's work, because I think it's all interlinked.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Bonnie. And yeah, keep it coming in the chat, folks. We've got some great stuff there. Ben, Ben Darlington, did you want to ask your question to the room?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. This isn't maybe particularly rewilding-ish, but sort of. What I'm interested in knowing is if there was some sort of data reporting service that people could use to understand semi-rewilding trends in their local community, if that makes sense. So in other words, near me, there's sort of local conservation areas that are allowed to go wild and whatever. If there was data coming out of that, what sort of data analysis do you think might be relevant and helpful for local people?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I don't know, Ben, if you know if there is anything at all like that. I mean, the question in a way boils down to how do we keep track of to what extent the kind of stuff that Ben has been talking about on this call has actually started happening?
Can I just slightly,
Ben, yes.
can slightly reveal my hand? So it's
Yeah.
In essence, I've been working on a platform for about the last year, which I call it vibing. It's like Twitter, but you just walk around and notice what you notice. And then I'm using artificial intelligence and machine learning to convert that into data for the local community here and near me. And it's sort of starting to sort of take off. And I'm now just standing back and looking at it and going, yeah, okay, this probably needs to be better than it is. So I'm just at this stage just looking, I'm just fishing for ideas and thoughts, I guess.
Yeah. And part of the reason why this is important is talking with civil servants in DEFRA lately, as I have been, it seems clear that there is going to have to be more citizen science in the future of this kind, also in relation to water, other stuff, because government is just not going to have the resources to do some of these things for us, even if it should. Ben Goldsmith, do you have any thoughts or knowledge in relation to this, or anyone else, if you do as well, also do feel free to speak up. Ben?
So I think the most exciting data is the data that's emerging from groups like Rewilding Britain, the National Trust, the Wildlife Trust, on just how many people want to get out into nature and are now participating in things like volunteering and just connecting with nature in different ways. Now, the numbers are huge. I think I saw recently that 10 times more people report regularly swimming in wild water, God help them, in this country, as compared with, a few years ago. Like people, and that Rewilding Britain has some brilliant stats around volunteering in rewilding sites. Now, there is just much more involvement in nature, much more yearning to be in nature that's being reported than previously. And with that, there's been this flourishing of technology, along the lines that we just heard about. Things like, Seek. There's an app called Seek, which is part of iNaturalist. There's millions of users now who go out and scan plants and bugs and fungi and things. And while they're learning in the process what those things are, it then gets collected in a database. That database is becoming a very, very important source of intelligence on where stuff is. And there's eDNA technology where nature metrics have figured out that you can take a thimbleful of water from a pond or a watercourse and identify exactly which species are in there. So there is this revolution happening in citizen participation in measuring and restoring nature. There's an initiative that I interviewed a guy called Elliot Newton for my Rewilding the World podcast recently, and he runs a thing called Citizen Zoo. And he's got thousands of citizen volunteers participating in river cleanups and removing invasive species. And they've been responsible for reintroducing water voles in Wandsworth and beavers in Ealing and glowworms in Tooting. And it's a London organization. So I think there's lots of exciting stuff happening around people being in nature and taking it into their own hands and becoming citizen conservationists, citizen rewilders, citizen scientists. I don't know. I can't point to any specific centralized piece of work. But one would hope that Natural England could keep tabs on this kind of stuff if they were properly funded and staffed up.
But there's the rub, isn't it?
Natural England should be it should be HQ for this generation restoration that we're living in.
Yeah.
Where Natural England, how can I put this? All the platforms that you've just talked about, Ben, make huge amounts of sense. But where they fail is they don't have local connections. In other words, what seems to matter to people is tying stuff to the walk that they go on, to the nature area that they use, in other words, everybody cares, but they care so much more when it's right there with their local community. Anyway,
no, it's undoubtedly true. That whole thing of think global, act local, that's real. Now, I've helped to set up and continue to chair an organization called the Conservation Collective. And it's exactly built on this principle that people in Devon tend to want to restore Devon. Or people in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland are overwhelmingly interested in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. People want to give their money and their time and so on locally. And I think there's a really important thing in there. That's why Citizen Zoo has just taken off in London. So I think that's bang on. But you do need air traffic control. You need an organization that can take a kind of high level view at the whole country and say, this is what nature recovery in England, roughly speaking, this is what it looks like. And we've got reference to a land use plan, a framework. We know what the different macro ecosystem types are, and that then is the kind of central coordinating body, which Natural England should be. And then local authorities and local farm clusters and local NGOs and local communities are then operating at a lower level on all of that.
Yes. Very good. We've got some interesting questions raised in the chat, but before going to any of those, I'm going to go to Phil Elliott and ask you for your remarks, Phil.
Hello, I'm very much enjoying the webinar, by the way. So I'm dipping my toe in the Climate Majority Project thing. So I was involved at early days in reforming. It was really good to see everyone today. This is going to turn into random jottings, really, because the discussion has really fired off a lot of things. The link to local rewilding and so on is something I'm quite keen on. I'm actually a vet, but through the last couple of decades, I've been involved in climate camp and all sorts of things. But I own a practice, and I do my best to sort of facilitate and help fund local wilding projects and also citizen science. And I think there is a groundswell of support with businesses and so on who might want to demonstrate their environmental credentials in sponsoring these sorts of things in the local community. For example, I've got a group that's testing for E. coli in our local river on a regular basis. I'm involved in some citizen science projects and so forth. So maybe that is something that can be tapped into. Local businesses have connections, maybe have a little bit of funding available to help facilitate these things. And the other random jotting is, and I think the brilliant thing about Climate Majority Project is that you're trying to tie threads from different aspects of climate change together, and people from different groups and so forth. There is such a thing in the veterinary community in the UK called Vet Sustain, which is looking into sustainable pet ownership. That's quite a subject in its own in its own right. And we're quite an active group. We're getting more influence within the profession, and I'll certainly do my best to raise this discussion in our working groups and try and encourage others within the veterinary profession to get involved in climate majority projects. I think it's a very useful forum to debate these things. There are other things. There are things I was going to talk about, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, that might be enough for now. I just want to say initially on what you said there, that's great. And what you've said at the end there, it's exactly what we're trying to do. It's exactly the spirit that we're trying to bring in the CMP. And part of what we think is that people where they live and where they work need to think about how to organize themselves in relation to the existential threat that we face. So yeah, vets organizing as vets would be a brilliant part of the overall CMP initiative. Ben, anything you wanted to say in response to Phil's remarks?
Just that I couldn't agree more, and I've never met anyone in any line of work who doesn't have, if you reflect upon it, the ability to make change in their area. Like, doesn't matter what your job is. There's always, what kind of company you work for or which part of the public sector you work for. There's always an opportunity to participate. And then in our free time, there's many more opportunities now than there were to participate locally in nature restoration. I mean, the wildlife trusts are brilliant at inviting people in, and lots of private sector rewilding projects as well. Farmers and things who are doing this are reliant on volunteer activities. So I think it's possible for anyone, anywhere, really, on some level, to make a difference on this and to derive huge joy from doing it. I'm part of a cluster of a combination of, it's the local council, one NGO called Heal Somerset, and a handful of farmers and other landowners who are rewilding a growing patch, like a growing ink blot of land in the middle of Selwood Forest. And there's nothing really that gives me a greater sense of meaning and joy and solace than just being out doing it, because it's possible to get a bit bogged down and sad, when you're reading stuff online and attending meetings like this, and even the optimistic ones, you think of the scale of the problem. But when you leave your phone inside and you go, especially you go outside with friends or family, and you're just planting willow whips in February, or I don't know, or surveying amphibians, or whatever it might be, or just being in nature, you just feel so good. I once read that one of the fathers of psychology, Carl Gustav Jung, said he summed up his life's work to say, if you give a person a few hours a week to have their hands in the soil and grow their own potatoes, they'll be happy. And there's truth in that. So I think that if I could be a minister in the next government, I think it might be education and not environment. I think the Minister of Education, in getting kids from a young age out into nature, to get them to understand this resource that's available to them. They're going to go through difficult times. They're going to be unwell. They're going to be bereaved. They're going to be depressed. At some point, they're going to have problems. And if they just have that resource available wherever they are, they can get outside and just be in nature, immerse themselves in it in whatever way, participate in it, grow their own vegetables, help in conservation work, then we'll just have a happier, healthier population. And I think that's, and we'll have a massive kind of army of people to do what needs doing. So I think reconnecting people with nature is probably the number one challenge. And I don't know that we're really, as a country, engaged with that nearly enough.
Wonderful. You've just reminded me of a wonderful remark by one of my influences, Shunryu Suzuki, was once asked, Suzuki Roshi, who was a great Zen Buddhist leader, tell us about the mind. How does the mind work? And he replied, I don't know anything about the mind. I just try to teach my students to hear the birds sing.
Yeah, I love that.
Very nicely. In terms of the point you made about the professions and work, Ben, I've actually gone through a bit of an exercise of thinking, yes, is there any profession or any workplace which doesn't really have a climate connection? I did manage to come up with one, which is pure mathematicians, but I think that's possibly about it. So yeah, I think the scope for the climate majority to do this kind of organizing is very wide. Right, we have about 5 minutes remaining. Does anyone want to ask a final question or two? Or alternatively, I can go to one or two of the questions that have been raised in the chat. So stick your hand up now or potentially forever hold your peace. Let's go to this question in the chat, which is from Paul P. What do people think about organizing a parallel economy around bioregions, connecting people back to the unique characteristics of where they live? What's your take on the bioregional economy, Ben?
Yeah, I think it goes back to this point about thinking global but acting local. And I think the keys to happy, healthy individuals, families, and communities is a sense of rootedness and connectedness to the place that they live. Now, we do have this idea that if we're going to be happy, we must work hard, save up, and spend our money jumping on a plane to go to another place in the world.
Yeah.
But actually, our own places, as we learned during the COVID lockdowns, are full of pockets of beauty, and they could be so much more vibrant if we just simply, as a community, chose it, and if the government assisted us in delivering it. So I think that sense of local connection, I think, is really an essential component to human well-being and happiness. And we're seeing more and more of it. I like I said at the very start of when you invited me to say a few words, I think we're witnessing an unbelievable shifting consciousness or shifting culture in this country, around nature. And people know what's local to them. They know what's. If I go to Frome near me, people will say to me, because they know I'm interested in beavers, did you know there's beavers behind Asda? They all know there's beavers breeding behind Asda. It's like people know, they wouldn't have known 20 years ago. It would have been considered like stamp collecting. So I think this knowing the soil beneath your feet, knowing the birds around you, knowing what happens at the changing of the seasons, I think these things are absolutely essential to human well-being. And I think it needs to start from a young age. I think we need to get kids into nature. The Ministry of Education is just so important. If I get a chance to lobby the next Labour government, which I hope I will, then I'm going to push really hard to try and bring a coalition of people to the Ministry of Education, say get kids out into nature. They don't need to teach them. They don't need to learn charts and learn. Nice if they know that stuff, but really just let them have a lovely time in nature a handful of times a year.
Paul, do you have a quick follow-up on that?
Yeah, just a very quick one, Rupert. Thank you, and thanks, Ben. Just to add that it is, of course, about nature, but it's also about the economy being entirely woven together with nature, and the ways that can make sense are often made sense of at a local level. I mean, we're working at the moment to set up a bioregional learning centre in the Forest of Dean, which has a unique kind of sense of identity and so on. But the local council is a green council, green dominated. And there's a potential of working with the Forest Economic Partnership to begin to start to define, how does business and nature work together, and how does it shift its way of being with nature, not simply what it does. So it's just offers a different frame, if you like, through which we can build the will for people to engage, right across all sectors. Not simply including those of us who have the luxury of sometimes spending a bit more time in nature than others.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more with that. Really well said.
Great. We are virtually out of time, folks. I'm just going to note the question asked earlier by the splendidly named question mark. What are your thoughts on how we can get more of the necessary conversations needed for change to take place outside the green bubble? So that really is in many ways the purpose of the Climate Majority project, and it's, I think, what a lot of us this morning have come to this call in search of. I have a sense that we've achieved some of that here this morning, and we certainly have quite an interesting balance of people on the call. So one of the things I'm going to encourage you to do as we come to an end here is to talk with people, to have some of those conversations outside the bubble about this conversation that we've just been having. One way you'll be able to do that is that in due course we will share the recording with those who are signed up with us. So do go to our website to sign up for updates on the Climate Majority Project. We're not a membership organisation. You can just sign up there for free and you will get emails. Ben, do you have a final sentence or two for us reflecting on what you've got out of this call here this morning?
Gosh, I'm just very grateful to be asked. I'm so excited to know about the group better, and I just think it's Climate Majority Project. It's all in the name. The majority want action. We just need to mobilize them and make make it feel less scary. You know, a lot of people turn away from this topic because they feel it's abstract and scary. And the key to that, I think, is localizing it. You know, we can live in greener, happier, more vibrant communities if we just address the climate crisis and restore nature. And I guess that's what you're all doing. So I'm really grateful to be part of this. Thank you for including me.
Thank
and
you
I
so
love
much.
a captive audience. I love a captive audience, by the way. I mean, yeah, it's the best.
Very, very good. Right, we love in the Climate Majority Project to finish things on time because there's no time to waste. So we will wrap up now. As I say, you will be hearing from us if you are signed up with us in some way. Thank you so much to everybody for coming this morning to this webinar. Thanks so much to Ben. As Sam Bowen mentioned at the start of the call, this is going to be a regular series, Climate Majority Thinks. We've got lots of interesting potential guests lined up. If you've got brilliant ideas for who we should talk to, let us know. One person we're hoping to get in the autumn, just as a little taster, is Khan Ross, the former diplomat who was fired and became an interesting, outspoken independent diplomat. And that is it from us here this morning. Thank you, everybody. And until next time, keep up the good work. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.